Good evening, everybody. Welcome again to Midweek in the City. I am very glad you have joined us for this episode. We have a continuation tonight of a conversation that was begun nationally, actually, or intensified nationally back in the spring, and we participated in that as a single adults group for about 9 weeks in our Conversations on Race series. Now here we are again to consolidate some of that thinking, to delve into some new thinking around the issues, the complex issues of race. And I'll introduce our guest in just a moment, but Megan and I are both very glad that we have this opportunity to be here with you this evening. Remember, Midweek in the City is predicated, founded, if you will, on questions. Because Jesus said, ask, seek, and knock. And we believe that the universe will yield to our questions because Jesus said so. And that's the way he lived his life with people. And he was always asking things like, what do you want me to do for you? What do you think about this? Who do you say that I am? And so we ask questions here, and we hope together that we can think new and that we don't have to be afraid, because we are following along in the way that Jesus taught us when we are asking honest questions. So welcome to Midweek in the City. Now let's get to our guest. Our guest this evening is Malcolm Foley of Baylor University. He is many things. I have learned many things. He comes to us tonight with a Master of Divinity degree from Yale Divinity School. But perhaps I think he would say more importantly for the moment that we all find ourselves in, he is special advisor to the president of Baylor University on equity and campus engagement. I hope after all our conversation, Malcolm, I hope I even said right. Anywhere close to right. Okay, good. And he is also the director of the Black Church Studies, the new Black Church Studies program at Truett Seminary. He is, as we speak, at this very second, he's probably thinking of ways that he can build up this program here, because he is the inaugural director of that. And we are very glad that you have taken the time to join us here, Malcolm. Welcome.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you.
And let's get right into these this conversation here tonight. And by the way, Malcolm, as you may know, I think there will be a Q&A after this time that you and Megan will be a part of. I wish I could be a part of that, but I can't. But anyway, so let's get into this.
Yeah. So Malcolm, you obviously, based on that introduction, you do a whole lot, and I'm assuming there's been an interesting journey up to this point. So could you just briefly tell us about that journey that has led you to the point you're at now at your church, at Baylor, your work on your dissertation? I don't know if we mentioned, he's also a PhD.
a bunch of stuff. You're also in a pastoral role, associate pastoral role at a church in Waco. And you are in the middle of writing your PhD dissertation.
Yeah. So would you just talk to us briefly about that journey that has come to this point for you?
So I can go back to kindergarten, or I can go back, or I could just go back a few years. So that the story is less than a half an hour. I'll just go back a few years. So when I did my MDiv, I focused on the early church and the Reformation, mostly the early church though, and most of it was because I did not want to be essentially just the black guy who talked about race all the time.
Yeah.
And so I consciously avoided many of those topics. I just thought, hey, I'll be a historical theologian. Those will be the books that I write and all that kind of stuff. And so when I applied for PhD programs, I applied only for theology programs and only to do the early church. But then Baylor took me into the church history program, specifically to do the Reformation. I was like, okay, that's fine. But it was a few years into the PhD that I took a class on American Christianity after the Civil War. And we got to the early 20th century. And we were talking about the fundamentalist modernist controversy and debates over biblical interpretation and power in seminaries, things like that. And there was a question that just nagged at me. And it was, Black men, women, and children are being set on fire across the South. What's the church saying or doing about that? Mm-hmm. And so I started looking through the literature, and I didn't find very much. That was disturbing to me. Also disturbing to me was the fact that the characterization of what Black Christians were doing was either that Black Christians were that they were either cowed into silence by lynching, or some other, or people just didn't talk about it at all. And so when I read those things, I just didn't believe them. So I said, if there aren't going to be any sources out there on this, any books particularly, this is what my dissertation is going to be. And so fundamentally, what the question that my dissertation asks is, how did Black Protestants resist lynching from 1890 to 1919, which is essentially the height of lynching, the height of particularly racial mob violence. And so the question is, how did Black Protestants respond? Because that's a period that's often kind of treated as a period of silence. And the argument that I'm making is that no, people are speaking, they're just not being listened to. And that's actually a kind of consistent theme, particularly in Black church history, where there's a struggle for racial justice. There's a constant kind of calling out to others to kind of come alongside us, and that call is often met with either silence or a justification of the violence that the Black church is suffering. Yeah. And so the dissertation explores that the different categories of resistance coming out of Black Christian communities. Yeah. And so that's the research. That's the book after I finish this, and things like that. So
awesome.
That's the nutshell.
And now, as of July, you're the special advisor to the president. And so, how did that come to be?
So for the last 2 years, I served on Baylor's board of regents. As the first graduate student to serve as a student regent. Up until me, it had been undergrads. And so when I took that role, that gave me the opportunity to build relationships not only with board members but also with the senior administration. And particularly after George Floyd's death. Mm-hmm. When a number of people were kind of putting together statements and things like that, Baylor reached out to me for some feedback and things like that. I gave it, and then it was revealed to me that there were some people in Baylor's leadership, particularly the president, who wanted me to work with them, and so the president made the position. And I took it. So that's how that came about. Awesome. And so I serve on the President's Council. Have input essentially at the highest levels of Baylor's administration. And it signifies kind of the fact that, there's a recognition. Hey, there are questions that we haven't asked. There are things that we haven't investigated. This can be so big of an issue that we don't necessarily kind of know where to start. Malcolm, can you help us? I was like, sure, we can figure this. We can figure this out. Yeah. And so that's what that work looks like. So these first few months especially have been just kind of getting a lay of the land before kind of figuring out, okay, these are these are the spots where we need to focus our attention.
And like you said, this is a huge question that so many, churches, schools, all of these, institutions are facing of, okay, we want to respond to this, but how do we do that well and comprehensively and, not miss something? So as we dig into that a little bit, what are some fundamental truths or ideas that we should start out with as we engage in this work of racial reconciliation in the church and in the community? What are some things to hold on to there?
So 4 things. It is necessary work, just work, difficult work, and new work. It's necessary. The necessary and just points go hand in hand. Insofar as Christ has commanded us to love our God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength, He's also commanded us to love our neighbor as ourselves. And so when we think about issues of particularly racial justice, it's necessary because Christ has commanded us to do it fundamentally, and to as a point of clarification, one of the first things that I said to Baylor's administration when we were talking about kind of the language that we use to describe this, what we're engaged in. I encourage them actually not to use the language of racial reconciliation.
Okay.
And here's why. There's a D.A. Horton deals with this in a book called Intentional. The idea of when we think of reconciliation, let's think particularly of the reconciliation between us and God. It's a restoration of a past peace. Adam and Eve had this peace with God, broke it because of their sin. When we think of particularly race in this country, we have never known a time of active racial peace. We don't actually know what that looks like because from the very founding of this nation, these racial narratives have circulated in order to justify genocide, slavery, all these things. And so we don't know what the country looks like without those things.
Yeah.
And so what we're looking at is ethnic conciliation. We're looking at active peacemaking. Those are the things that we're actually seeking, because we don't have anything in the past to look to as a model of saying, hey, well that's the way that this society ought to run. Yeah. There's a sense in which this is a trailblazing work, which is why I referred to it as new work. Because the fact of the matter is that at every step of this process throughout our history, there's been we have to think about the problem differently. So, for example, when slavery was quote unquote abolished, it was sort of abolished, but it was also sort of just moved into the criminal justice system.
Right.
And that's just the 13th Amendment. But at many of these kind of hinge points in American history, whether we're looking at emancipation, the end of Reconstruction, the lynching in Jim Crow era, even the Civil Rights Movement, as particular racist practices fade, other ones pop up in its place, because the underlying narratives often go kind of untreated. Yeah. Easiest example is slavery. While slavery is made technically illegal unless you've been convicted of a crime, narratives of racial inferiority still remain. And people just find other ways to instantiate those ideas and use those ideas to oppress and to subjugate. So that's that. So this is work that is necessary and just. Both of those things go back to Christ's commands. And it's also, and it's difficult and new. The difficulty is something that I hope has also been made clear from what I was just saying for the last few minutes. But it's constantly shifting, and the like I said, the kind of ingenious ways that people use these ideas and systems in order to cause pain is constantly changing. And so in order to battle that, we have to be constantly vigilant. Yeah. I mean, the work of loving our neighbors is never a stagnant work. It's a very dynamic one.
Yeah, man, that's really helpful language, because that's the first time that I had heard that racial reconciliation is really not a great term, and for that, that's the first time I had heard that explanation. That's really, really helpful to me. Thank you for talking through that.
Oh, of course.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, I'm here. I'm just contemplating. I am struck by many things that you've said. And by the way, the difficult part, I think many folks that I talk to, and that, just people that I see and visit with and so forth, white largely, these conversations, people get frustrated that it is difficult. And I think sometimes that frustration, perhaps otherwise well-meaning people, and I want to use that very cautiously, because it is easy for me as a white person to say, well, these folks are well-meaning. You have to be the judge of how you receive that, but people get frustrated when something is difficult, and when it comes to, I think I'm glad you acknowledge that, because it is difficult, and the sands do seem to shift, and there are bad actors in this from a power standpoint. People want to hold on to power and so forth. And
if I may add something to that. It's also very easy for us to root this in intention.
Absolutely, yeah.
And in many ways, that allows us to absolve ourselves of ways in which, because people have spent so much time kind of systematically building these things to work without them, essentially.
Right. That's great.
We have a situation where you don't have to. You don't have to, quote unquote, intentionally be racist in order to still contribute to things that kind of lead to kind of unjust outcomes and opportunities for particularly people of color. So yes, that's a minor point.
I'm glad you said that, because it is the case, isn't it? I mean, we read a book together called Divided by Faith. Are you familiar with that book?
Yeah, I've got it over here somewhere.
Okay, yeah. And it's interesting, of course, two white men wrote that book, but it is, in talking, the interviews that they do with people of color and with white people are interesting, because the white people, and their contention in the book is that a racialized society really is an automatic divider. It doesn't require, it just sort of runs on its own, and we can be deistic racists, if you will. We don't have to be involved in the down and dirty work of racism. You know what I mean? It just runs by itself. Yeah. And your statement that these systems are designed not to need maintenance, or I don't know how you exactly said that, but they're designed to.
That's a good way of putting it.
To run on their own. So it is. I think it's that very thing is difficult to grasp sometimes, horrifyingly so, actually. And so I think that up front, your embrace of that actually can be helpful. It's not an off-putting thing. It doesn't have to be. I think it can say, yes, this work is difficult, so it's going to take our all of us looking at this honestly. But in that light, Malcolm, I want to say to you, this is this is so complex, and because a lot of it is invisible, and as we just said. What are some facile explanations that really undercut the work of healing and peacemaking? Facile explanations, facile actions, things that seem to have a surface sheen of let's all, join hands and become a brotherhood of, whatever. I mean, help us understand how this is facile and how glomming onto these kinds of things actually works against what is needed.
Yeah. So two things. I guess the two things that I've heard so often that now they grate against me, and I'll be very clear when I explain why these two things grate on me. So the first is why don't you just focus on the gospel? And the second and the second is, well, if we just all the friendship point. If we just all become friends, then
start having coffee with your black friend or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And that's a good step, but
sure.
that's not the end. I'll deal with that one second. I want to deal with the just focus on the gospel. That claim, that admonition, just focus on the gospel, suggests an anemic understanding of the gospel of Jesus Christ.
An anemic understanding. Yeah. Okay.
And right. it suggests that Christ came only to proclaim a message rather than to actually change you and change the world. Mm-hmm. And that's the actual work that the Holy Spirit is actively engaged in. It suggests that it suggests even that the careful application of the Ten Commandments is not actually part of the good news. Because Christ,
that's pretty damning, actually.
It is actually. But here's why I'm engaged in this work particularly. So I'll throw this bombshell. I'm a confessional Presbyterian. And so for me, for me, I love Westminster. And so in the Westminster Catechism, there's when they lay out the Ten Commandments, it's not just the sins forbidden, but it's also the duties required.
Okay.
And so when you look at the sixth commandment, thou shalt not murder. One of the duties required of the sixth commandment, and this is kind of in summary, is basically setting yourselves against in thought, word, and deed, setting yourselves against anything that tends toward the unjust taking away of the life of any. That's a duty required of the sixth commandment. So it's not only God commanding me not to kill my neighbor, but it's actually God commanding me to actively seek the life of my neighbor. Mm. And so when we're dealing with these issues of particularly racial justice, we're looking at matters of life and death. We're looking at systems and actions and things like that lead to people dying. And so because of that, it's actually my responsibility as a Christian, as somebody who has been united to Christ by faith, by means of the Holy Spirit, that I have to, that essentially for me to be obedient to the Lord, I have to be setting myself against those things, because I have to be actively supporting the life of my neighbor, because that's what love is.
Yeah.
And so that's I think that's a hugely important part of this. So all of that's to say just focus on the gospel suggests that this is not part and parcel of it.
Yeah.
And this goes back. Well, I know there's a future question where I'll kind of go into particular scriptures that suggest and back that up. But it's important. But it's important for us to understand that that there's also a particular way that a life shaped by the gospel ought to look. And it's my contention that that specifically actively seeking to support your neighbor's life in as many ways as you possibly can is one of the things that is integral to a gospel saturated life.
Okay.
So that's point one. The other one, the let's just be friends thing.
Yeah.
So here's a scenario. Let's say that aliens come to Earth, and they're especially benevolent, and so they find the first person they meet. Let's say it happens to be a homeless man on the street, and they tell him, "Hey, we've got these 3 magic potions. One of them is going to solve all. One of them is going to solve all racist thinking. So you put this in the water supply." Nobody, and the next day, like, no one's going to be racist anymore. Second potion deals with classist ideas. So you do the same thing. Wake up the next day, nobody's going to have these kind of negative thoughts about people of other socioeconomic statuses, things like that.
Okay.
Third one deals with the issue of sexism. Same deal. And so this guy chooses the classism one.
So he has to choose one. He has to choose
Gotta choose one.
Okay.
Gotta choose one. So he chooses the classism one, puts it in the water. Next day. The question is his life substantively different because he's put that in the water supply? I would suggest that he still doesn't have a home that next day. I would suggest that yes, thinking about one another differently and justly is important, but also important is the way that we actually treat one another.
Okay.
And so this is not just a matter of me. Part of it is me building new relationships. But as I build new relationships, one of the things that I'll also find is that people are affected by more than just their one-on-one relationships with kind of individuals that they know. Yeah. Even when we look at, so this goes back to divided by faith. That one of the 3 tools in the white evangelical toolbox is this accountable free will individualism, and this understanding that when I see someone in adverse circumstances, my first impulse is to think, oh, they're there because of choices that they've made. Yeah. And one of the things that fundamentally undermines that is the fact that, I mean, we live in a world that rewards particular people making particular choices, and then can actually and then actually punishes others who choose to make those same decisions in different circumstances. Sometimes it's along the lines of race. It can be along the lines of class and gender. All of these things. Fact of the matter is that your choices have a particular effect because they're choices in a particular system, and because you are the particular person that you are. Right. And so it's much more complex than, well, I made these choices, thus I'm in this situation. And the sooner we can get to that point, the sooner the relationships that we have reveal to us, hey, wait a minute. There's more to this than just, like I said, than just this individual choice that you made in this particular situation. Yeah. It's just the goal is for us to kind of widen. We're going to have to widen our view, of what it, like I said before, what it means to love my neighbor. Yeah. Yeah. And a project like society
daring to take on a project like societal change, that's a big project, but when has Christianity been asked to think smaller than that? I mean, really, I'm just thinking. We think, well, that's a huge kind of thing. Why not just focus on one person at a time? I'm not sure that we have to do one to the exclusion of the other.
Yeah, and the fact of the matter is, so this goes back to the loving your neighbor thing. We're no longer in a situation where we only affect people one person at a time. Like all of us have in whatever sphere we're in, we have access to more than whether it's through social media or whatever. All of these things actually expand our understanding of who our neighbor ought to be.
That's right. Yeah. That's right.
Which then also ought to expand the way that we think about what it means to love that neighbor.
Yes.
Because loving your neighbor doesn't, that command never goes away. And so
that's right.
As your neighbors increase, your responsibility to love them also increases. And so when you think about particularly the social and political influence that you have, because you have it, the question is then, am I using this to the glory of God and for the good of my neighbor? And the more that influence increases, the more that responsibility increases.
Oh wow, yeah.
And so when we think of in Matthew 25, I want to say, I'm pretty sure it's 25. It's either 25 or 26. But when Jesus returns and separates the sheep from the goats and asks, "Did you feed the hungry?" and things like that.
Yeah.
It's not that question. That question then for us is more than just, did you see this hungry person and feed them? It's also, hey, you've actually had a part in building a system that actually makes people go hungry. Have you contributed to the tearing down of that, or at least a reshaping of it in a way that actually doesn't lead to people being hungry? We can think about mass incarceration because the prisoner is considered in that text as well. It's not just, did you visit the prisoner, but insofar as you were able to keep that person from unjustly being imprisoned in the first place, did you contribute to that? And so to pair with kind of the way that Christ normally deals with the law in the sense that, hey, you want to make this easy, but it's actually more difficult. The way that he treats adultery and murder, that it's not just about this thing that you do, but it's also about the intention that precedes it.
Right.
As your social and political power extends further than, many of the disciples, further than even Paul in the Roman Empire, like you, particularly as a member of a democratic republic, have a certain amount of social and political power. The responsibility then compounds with it. It's a little bit.
No, that's incredibly helpful. And we, like you said, with our spheres of influence, they're larger now than ever before. And our group members, they're engaged in this community in FBC, and they're also engaged in their own communities, in their workplaces, and their families.
Workplace, community,
So what is this work of seeking justice and moving forward in this work? What does that look like in those work contexts, like for example, where you're at Baylor, and then also, this is a big question, but then also, what does that look like in the church? Because I know those are probably different.
Yeah. So the university is not a church, even though it's a Christian university, is not a church. And so there's a certain kind of there's a certain institutional mission, but also but also kind of culturally, you're dealing with a different you're dealing with this, you're dealing with a different set of circumstances too.
Yeah.
And so what this looks like in a university context, this goes to kind of questions of what is diversity, what is inclusion, what is equity.
Yeah.
And so diversity is about kind of the presence of a bunch of different people. But antebellum churches were diverse in the sense that white and black people worshiped together, technically. But the power differential was pretty clear.
Right.
And so then inclusion is this next step of, hey, everybody's actually being listened to. There's a and what equity is the process to get to that point. So the process of actual power sharing, the process of kind of making sure that everybody has the resources to be able to freely engage in the places where they are. And so at Baylor, for me, it's a matter of, finding out, hey, does everyone have the resources to be able to do their job well? Because there are many who, so for example, just as a quick example, when racialized minority faculty come to campus, especially because there are so few of them, there is more pressure. There's more pressure on them, particularly to mentor students of color.
Yeah.
And so this is what's called by some as the cultural tax. And so more is expected of these particularly faculty members. But they're kind of expected to do that more with just kind of the same number of same amount of resources, same amount of support, those things like that. And that's why a number of people burn out and go to other places. And so there has to be the recognition that, when people are interacting with in different circumstances, some people need more resources to be able to do those things well. That's one of the distinctions between equality and equity, where equality is just saying that everybody gets the same thing. Equity recognizes, hey, some people actually may need more to be able to do the things,
Right.
be able to do the things that they need to do, especially in light of historical circumstances. This is one of the things that's important. I mean, it's important at the university level, and it's important at in the church. So let's make the church point. The reason why predominantly black churches exist historically is that many predominantly black denominations began with multi-ethnic churches where black members came to the white leadership and said, hey, our worship is being actively restricted. Can we go start our own church so that we can actually worship the Lord freely? And the response was, yeah, sure. Go do your own thing. We'll send somebody to watch you, but go do your own thing. That was the response, as opposed to repentance, as opposed to the response, we're actively restricting your worship. We ought to repent and find ways that we can actually worship together, because that's what Christ has actually called us to do. Instead, the path was taken, it's actually much easier if you just kind of go do your own thing over there.
Yeah.
And we'll keep doing our thing over here. And so that then suggests to me, and this is an important point to make, that historically, when we look at particularly predominantly white churches and predominantly black churches, we're looking at two distinct phenomena. Like those two things are not morally equivalent, really, historically, because one was essentially a group of people who were like, look, this is actually a space where we can't worship, and we're being treated as though we're second class. And for us to be able to affirm our own dignity, we need to go somewhere else. That in itself is an indictment, and a kind of painful one to reckon with, but an indictment nonetheless. And so this goes back. This will be the last point I make with this. I think this was also in Divided by Faith, that for a number of predominantly white communities, when you think of racial reconciliation, people think, oh well, we just need more black people to come to our church, which is a one-sided way to think about it, because maybe there are things that you need to learn from them, as opposed to thinking, well, think of how much of a benefit it would be for them to come to us. Well, think about the fact that there's a robust historical and theological history that's come out of that tradition, which really ought not have been an entirely separate tradition, but it had to be because historically people were in places where their worship was actively restricted, and so the fact that we have an American church tradition that has built there's been so much deep historical and theological gold that's specifically come as the fruit of unique suffering. The fact that that's happened is lamentable, but it's also a gold mine for the church globally. And the sooner that it's recognized as such, the better the entire body of Christ will be.
Now, what do you mean by that? A gold mine for the church globally?
What I mean is that we have always had much to learn from those who suffer.
Oh, I see. Okay.
When we hear Paul say, that the sufferings of this present time are no comparison to the joy set before us, it can be very easy to cheapen. It can be very easy to cheapen that. But the fact of the matter is that we have had, particularly Black Christians, who have said that for a while, and these are people who have undergone slavery, lynching, Jim Crow, all of these things, just essentially a culture of death, and still through police brutality, other things like that. These things that are poised for our death, and yet in the midst of it, there's a through line of hope, of recognition that, hey, Christ has actually saved us. Christ has actually declared that we actually have worth. And so regardless of what others say or do to us, this is what we know to be true of ourselves. That's a witness. Yeah. That's a witness to the world. And that's ultimately what the Christian witness is supposed to look like.
Malcolm.
And so the more that I said, the more that every Christian in the world can see that as helpful and as edifying. That's another way. That's another way to keep kind of pushing us forward. So,
Malcolm, you're reframing my own thinking in real time here, because I remember reading in Divided by Faith about the origin of the Black church, but I had not thought of it as a living repository of the power of the gospel through suffering.
Yep.
And therefore, if we will, it's sort of like in listening to you, what I was thinking about was the heap of stones that often the Hebrews would build as a memorial and a living place where they could come back to and remember and be renewed about how God helps.
Yep.
And so the black church is the world's heap of stones, if you will. It could be that we say, teach us. We need to learn and we need to know what you remember about how God saves through suffering. Is that fair to say?
It's true of persecuted churches around the world, and it's just that in this country, the persecuted church has been pretty consistent.
That's a connection that I have not made either. That black churches stand with the persecuted church. It is in this format, in the American experience, that's where the persecuted church is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yep, and that's those are often. I mean, even when we think of, I mean, it's those communities are often the ones that we have the most to learn from, because we're often tempted. We're so tempted towards just running to comfort. And the way of the cross is not the way of comfort.
Yeah.
So if we are to learn the robust meaning of God's power and suffering, we're going to have to pay attention to the black church.
Yep.
I just got a book. I haven't started reading it. I'm reading the preface now, called "Reading While Black." It's by a man named Esau McCaulley.
Yeah, I did a review of that book.
What's that?
Love it. I did it. I wrote a review.
Okay.
Cool.
Love it. Absolutely love it.
Well, my point is, where are the black theologians? And I'm probably all over the map on these questions here. I'm sorry. I just want to throw this out here. Where is our shaping and our being informed by black theologians on the power of the gospel? And I want to leave that there. We need these voices, and we need to be hearing them and be shaped by them, I think.
Yep.
Please.
No, that's one of the questions we even discussed was, where do these, black theology, womanist theology, Mujerista theology,
theology,
these things that are not necessarily held as central in the white evangelical church. How can we take ideas from those theologies, and how can those realistically impact the more traditional evangelical church?
And will that begin to unite the church?
Mm-hmm.
Once we recognize that everybody's questions aren't our questions, that's an important step forward. So often, so when we think about, for example, when we think about apologetics, different communities think about apologetics in different ways. When some think of apologetics, you think of kind of philosophy, proving the existence of God, things like that.
Right.
For a number of black Christians, apologetics look different. So this is what the Jude 3 project is about. Apologetics is twofold. One, it's within black communities. How do I narrate the fact that Christianity is not the white man's religion? That's a huge apologetic obstacle, particularly for black Christians.
Yeah.
And then there's also just the very fundamental question of the problem of evil. How can I say that God exists when I have suffered so much evil? It's not just there's evil in the world. No, like there's evil that I have suffered.
Yeah.
There is a constant. I think about particularly in the lynching era, where there's the risk. If someone near you is accused of a crime, that puts your life in danger. Mm. How as someone who, like I said, is constantly facing death, what does God's existence do for me in that situation? Those are the fundamental apologetic questions of many many Black communities. James Cone in Crossing the Lynching Tree kind of lays this out too, that fundamental to particularly the Black Christian experience is how can God exist when I'm suffering so much. And the through line of the cross and the resurrection is what slices through that. But we have to understand that that different communities are going to have different questions, all of which are biblical. All these are biblical questions,
Right?
All these are and the fact of the matter is that the more of these things that we engage with, the more fully orbed our understanding of the Word of God becomes. Because then we begin to realize, wait a minute, these questions that I've been asking just within my own community has really only given me kind of one side of what is kind of God's full revealing of himself to his people. And so really, for us to be true to the calling that God that Christ has called us to, it requires us to ask more questions than the ones that we're used to, and it also forces us to reckon with the fact that maybe the reason why I haven't asked these questions is because I've actually actively shielded myself from them.
Yeah,
and I may be actually contributing to making you ask this question.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
That's a lot. But that is, I think, fundamental. That's I think core to how we're to push forward.
Yeah. That's so helpful.
That's way too rich for these few minutes. I can't.
I'm just
my
thinking,
brain is exploding.
Just in my own
Well, it's
work.
recorded, so we can come back.
Yeah, really.
I mean, really,
It's almost too much for
insightful.
Zoom. I mean, I wish you could be here in person
know.
because I think I could take it in
We
better.
can do a part
maybe.
2.
It's amazing.
Yeah, I don't know.
Where are I don't know. Where are we out of time? Let's do this. What are the questions local churches can ask, Malcolm?
Yeah.
Especially, we're talking in a largely white context here. So what are these questions that we can ask? And if I may, what are the questions we can ask that will shape how we take an internal inventory? Shape hiring, shape missions, shape financial stewardship. What are the questions? Help us.
Yeah. Oh, so there are a few. One is to consider who your social networks are. So not just this is you want to avoid the black friend phenomenon. Where you just find somebody who doesn't look like you, but still thinks like you, and you just use that as a justification of the ways that you think. When you start building networks of people, then you start also finding, wait a minute, it could be the case. Wait a minute, a lot of the people that I'm meeting seem to think differently than me. That seems like a pretty big deal. I should probably dig into that.
Okay.
And that'll start to kind of chip away. That'll start to chip away at some of these things. But also it's a matter of getting involved. Most of these things, engagement at the local level, whether it's with city council, school boards, all these kinds of things, like you'll be able to see what we indicated before, that these things just kind of function on their own. When you actually start involving yourselves in these systems that really do affect your child's life, your life, all these things, you'll see some of this. You'll see some of this at work. So I mean, here's one. I mean, this and then I'll get back to the church thing. When people who make, so big example, the Breonna Taylor decision, the decision of who to indict and for what is made by district attorneys. But that's often an election that people don't pay very much attention to at all. Yeah. And the amount of influence that individual has over a number of these cases that we've especially seen over the course of the last few months is overwhelming. Yeah. And so, but the only way that you see some of these things is if you're kind of asking the question of going back to the question thing. So I see that Black men are overrepresented in the prison population. I can just take the easy way out and say, oh, well, that's just because Black men commit more crimes. That would be racist for me to say. But we have to recognize that's a racist thing for me to say. We have to move from that recognition of that fact, because it's a fact that Black men are overrepresented in the prison population. But we've got to go to the next step of thinking, hey, well, what is it what's the process that leads from somebody being accused of a crime to actually being in prison? There are actually a number of steps in between.
Yeah.
And even before the accusation of a crime, because you start asking questions of policing, of who gets, of who's actually indicted for things, of courtroom proceedings, all these things that make things more complex. Mm-hmm. But the fact of the matter is that life is complex. We just gotta get used to it. And to go back to what I was saying before, loving your neighbor is complex. So we just got to get used to it. And so when you look at your church, when you look at the commentaries that people are often using, the examples that are even used in sermons, what you consider when you think about, for example, ministry, particularly with the poor. Do you see this as a coming alongside, or do you see it as a reaching down? Those are two things that people know and can tell.
Yeah.
When you're especially dealing with economically disadvantaged communities, are you making clear when you go into these situations, hey, we're coming in to help you? Mm-hmm. Well, hold on, because there are actually probably strengths in these communities that can be built up as well. Yeah. Kind of coming in with the savior complex is Christ is the savior, and he's come to save all of us, and we're essentially all just beggars trying to point one another to where to find bread.
Yeah.
And so when that humility shapes everything that we do, then that cuts against much of the evil that's come as a result of racism has been essentially the result of pride and greed. Both of those things are fun. Pride, greed, and self-interest are more fundamental to these evils than an understanding of race. Because fact of the matter is that race is essentially a tool used by people to justify their greed, self-interest, and pride.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so because of that, it's important for us not to kind of get not to get kind of stuck at the level of racial narratives, because fundamentally our issue is deeper. Even if we were to comprehensively kind of form a racially just society, people would still be greedy, proud, and self-interested.
That's a great point. Yeah.
And so people will find ways to do those things. And so in engaging in this work, it's important to remember that it's lifelong work. Yeah. It took us centuries to get to the place where we're at, and we haven't had a significant period of time where you have a critical mass of folks fighting fighting against this injustice. And so we ought to expect this to take some time. And particularly for Black communities, it has felt as though all of the weight has been on us for a while. And so one of the things that could be encouraging is that, there are people who are getting on board now, but with that, there are also folks who are hardening in the midst of the last few months as well. So it's a constant kind of push pull.
It is, and we really probably are just, we've totally run out the clock, I think. But and I feel like we've just barely, been engaging in small talk here that's been huge in its implications, because there's so much more to talk about. But that small talk has, as I said, has already reframed the issue in my head even more. But I do want to say, you alluded to some things that are encouraging. Is this a good time to be engaged in the work that you're doing? Is there more hope or less hope? What do you see? What drives you forward in this? I'm guessing that you wouldn't be continuing to drive forward if you just saw a cliff ahead, that you were driving off of. So, what is the hope quotient here?
I would hope, actually, that my hope remains the same as it was years ago, and that my hope is the exact same 20 years from now if I'm still involved. I'll still be involved in this work in some capacity, but that's because my hope is not rooted. My hope is not rooted in how many people are partnering with me in this work. My hope is rooted in the fact that this is work that Christ is actually doing. And my hope is rooted in the fact that it's work that he's going to finish. And so this is one of the things that I can then link hands with people from all kinds of different backgrounds who are still engaged in this work. But I also ought to have more stamina in this work than they do, because if you're just doing this kind of out of duty or whatever, when you hit the walls that everyone hits, disillusionment, all of those things are going to hit hard. Happened to W.B. Du Bois, happened to Martin Luther King in the last few years of his life, where progress was just so slow that there were some days that they didn't want to get up out of bed because they're just like, progress is just so slow. But especially for King, and particularly for anyone united to Christ by the Holy Spirit, you don't have an option to not engage in this stuff, because this is the work that Christ is doing and has called us to join in with him. And so my hope is fundamentally in the fact that I said Christ started it, and he's going to finish it. May not be in my lifetime, may not be in my child or grandchild's lifetime, but that actually doesn't have any effect on whether or not I still have to do it. And Christ has given he has given us the resources to push through, even when we hit up against these walls that appear to be insurmountable, because we serve a God who is actually insurmountable. And so anything else that seems there may be other things that seem insurmountable, but they're not, because we actually serve a God who is.
Now that is hope. Yeah. There's one thing that I think I left out here, and that is, and very briefly, what do you look at if you saw a predominantly white church and you saw something that they were doing that was moving them from just talking about this to doing? What would that thing be?
I would say actively working together with the other churches in your community, particularly predominantly Black or other other churches with different ethnic makeups than your own, because one of the things about actively building those relationships is that you start to find, wait a minute, the ways in which you're involved in the community are different from the ways that we're involved. They're actually because and the fact of the matter is that kind of cross pollination actually also because there are going to be ways that you can help them and ways that they can help you. But you won't know those things unless you actually build these relationships. And so I was part of a church that did kind of a it was a predominantly white church, and they did kind of a one-off with a historically black church, and the idea was, hey, we did it. And the guy who I co-pastored Mosaic with, I'll soon be co-pastor. I'm not ordained yet. I want to be very clear about that, but getting there. But he was the one in leadership who said, like, wait a minute, no, these are relationships that we actually have to invest in, because the fact of the matter is they're right down the road, and the questions that they're asking are completely different from ours. That seems like that seems weird. I should be involved in this.
Okay.
There's clearly something I need to, there are clearly some things that I need to learn. And that's then the approach, because when we can come alongside each other, we can start seeing examples like we see in Paul's letters, where there's mutual exchange in these churches. It's not it's much less siloed, and more of us actually seeing ourselves as members of one another. And that's the way that the Church of Christ actually ought to be. And so the more we can invest in actually appearing to the world as Christ actually describes us in his word, then we can come to the point where we're known by our love, as opposed to being known for other things.
That's a dose of hope there. Thank you. And thank you for taking your time to be with us for Midweek in the City, Malcolm.
Glad to do it.
Godspeed to you, and keep teaching the church. We need to hear this. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and we're excited to continue this conversation with the Q&A. So jump on Zoom as soon as you're done watching this, and we'll follow up with a Q&A. So,
absolutely.
Yeah, thank you guys.